This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. On this episode, the guest is award-winning historian James Zug. James earned a master's degree in nonfiction writing from Columbia and has written for numerous national print publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Outside, Boston Globe, and the Wall Street Journal, as well as many websites such as the Daily Beast, Town and Country, and Vanity Fair. He has authored a half dozen books, including one on an anti-apartheid newspaper in South Africa and another on the 18th century American explorer John Ledyard. He is a global expert on racket sports, having played and written about tennis, squash, court tennis, rackets, paddleball, padel, platform tennis, and stick tennis. Scribner put out his History of Squash book in 2003 and is republishing an updated version later this year. And Run to the Roar, Coaching to Overcome Fear, his best-selling book on Paul Asciante, the Trinity squash coach, is close to being made into a major motion picture. The guest interviewer for this episode is David Letourneau, a Canadian-American world-ranked squash player and entrepreneur. He has a BS in mechanical engineering from Princeton University, where he was captain of the men's squash team. Dave and James have known each other for years, and I cannot think of a better person to talk to Jim about his love of the game and his passion for writing about it. Gentlemen, I'm looking forward to a great conversation about history, squash, and the writer's life. So, David, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Jim. This is great. And we were chatting just before hitting record about squash is just a dear game to me. I've played it my whole life. I think about it. I dream about it. I watch it all the time. And I'm embarrassed to say I hadn't read A History of Squash until the last few weeks. And it's brought this whole new context to the game and history to the game. I'm just so excited, Jim. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Thanks, both of you guys.
So I'm going to get right into it. I always heard the rumors that squash was invented in a prison, and then I've also heard it had been in a private school. It sounds like it's a bit of a mix of both, but I was wondering if you could maybe talk about the origins of squash, and maybe in particular in England, and we can come back to America in a second.
So that's right. It was definitely invented at a private school, at a boarding school in London, on the edge of London. You can reach it by subway, and I spent a week going out by subway every day to research what happened at Harrow School, a boys' prep school there at the edge of London, where the game of rackets, which is sort of basically hitting a golf ball in a enclosed space, was a very popular game throughout England and really the world in the 18th century. 19th century, they invented Charles Goodyear figured out how to vulcanize rubber. And so that meant starting in the late 1840s that you could play games with rubber balls. And basically, the boys at Harrow took rubber balls and the rackets they were using for this game of called rackets, and they started playing in the courtyards and alleys at their school. And every courtyard had different features, and it was all sort of fun that you could hit it off a window ledge or a door. They sort of created this version of a game that had been around for 200 years. So in 1865, they built some courts for another game, a version of handball. And handball is very popular at English boarding schools. And it's called fives, and there's different versions of fives. So Harrow builds a bunch of fives courts. And instead of the boys playing fives in these courts, they sort of migrated their strange new game with rubber balls into those courts. And that's how officially in 1865, squash began as a sort of organized game.
All right, cool. Yeah. So it's, and I'm wondering, so I was reading about this, and I guess, you've written about basically all racket sports, it seems like, and how they sort of evolved from one another, sometimes cannibalized one another. So Okay, so racquetball, and I was reading there was the underclassmen, I think, weren't allowed to play rackets, and so they were using squash.
They weren't allowed on the rackets courts, and so they would play their funny game on in these courtyards, and yards and alleys and stuff. And then when they sort of co-opted these fives courts for this new game, which was sort of called baby rackets, they sort of let them do that, and that became it became something that all the boys who went to Harrow in the 1850s and 60s, 1870s, they all played both outside in the courtyards and in these sort of official courts. And when they would leave Harrow, they often built courts themselves back at their houses, in stables and barns or in yards. And that became sort of the norm for the rest of the century. Was like, oh yeah, you leave Harrow, go home and build your own court. With its own rules,
as one does.
So there dozens of alums would have some sort of makeshift squash court in a barn behind their house.
So I was just gonna. So it seems to me I didn't realize how close it, as far as I understand it. That's sort of the 1840s, 1850s. It sounds like, and then squash coming to America was actually fairly quick thereafter, right? In 1880s, is that right? And I'm just gonna throw this in there. It did come from Canada.
No,
no. Oh no.
Canada.
Not all things start in Canada, Dave. Sorry.
Canada's great. Canada's fantastic. They brought down ice hockey, lacrosse, right? You guys have imported some great sports to the U.S., but the one of the people who did import ice hockey to the States, he was a student at Columbia, and in the 1870s, and he was playing the game of rackets. Again, the father of squash. He was playing that game in New York. And he had a classmate at Columbia who also played with him. And that classmate had gone to Harrow and had told him, oh, by the way, we have this crazy new game that is sort of like rackets, only, slower and less insane. And so he built a couple rackets courts up at St. Paul's in New Hampshire. And then on the advice of his roommate at Columbia, he built some squash courts. And so those were put in 1884. And so America was the first country outside of Great Britain to build squash courts because the game was brand new. There were no rules. Nothing was standardized. It was like every barn, every alleyway had its own rules. And so they built a couple courts at St. Paul's sort of far earlier than anybody else did, simply because of this sort of odd connection to Harrow.
And just to interject, one of the first students to learn how to play squash at St. Paul's was a gentleman, or a teenager named Archibald Gracie IV, later Colonel Archibald Gracie IV, who would feature later in probably the most famous squash court that's now at the bottom of the sea. Yes. He ended up surviving the Titanic, but he writes about, of course, I was delighted to find a squash court on board the ship, and I would work off my lavish meals on the squash court.
One of the fun things, I'm living in England right now, and have gotten connected to a squash club outside a village near here that the pro on the Titanic would have played squash on this court, and so I've been able to connect with descendants of the pro and learn more about his life. And he had been a pro on a sister ship the year before the Olympic, and made a wrong career choice to switch from the Olympic to the Titanic in April 1912, unfortunately.
So what happens? I mean, a game is invented, first courts are built, and then 20 years later, we're building courts on ocean liners. Yeah. That's incredible to me. And I don't know what do you think drove that? Like what's happening in America at that time? That's, how did it get so viral so quick?
I think some of the attributes of squash that you and I love, and that have always sort of been a core part of the game. The simplicity of it, the gladiatorial nature, one person against another person, the incredible workout. People didn't really talk about that in the 1890s, but it clearly was part of it. And the sort of novelty of it. I think anytime there's something new, people gravitate to that. So you combine sort of the inherent characteristics of the game with the novelty, and it got adopted by the sort of Gilded Age, the upper class in America and around the world. And so the Titanic, the builders thinking, oh, well, we should have a squash court. That's right. 20 years earlier, they would never have heard of it. But, after the turn of the century, all around the world, people started building squash courts at clubs in cities, country clubs, and even high schools and universities, so that by 1912, it was considered something that, people would enjoy while they're crossing the Atlantic.
Yeah, and Steve and I were talking about this before you came on too, Jim, and Steve, you spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the Gilded Age and just sort of the dynamics of sort of, I guess, urbanization. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, in your experience, if you have any ideas as to what might have driven this as well. Building of many country clubs were built around this time, like you said, Jim. Steve, what did you take away from it when you were reading?
I mean, I think it was a reflection of starting the 1880s, of the rise of a new upper class and upper middle class, a lot of whom decided to move out of townhouses in, say, I don't know, Washington Square or Rittenhouse Square to places like the Main Line, Chestnut Hill, Mount Airy, developed by the railroad. So you had this move out of the city center. And you had the development of clubs like Marion, Germantown, Philly Cricket. And it became sort of an accoutrement of a suburban quasi-English lifestyle that was afforded by the railroads. And I think that was a big part of it. It was sort of part of the Philly Cricket, from what I understand, was basically built by the Houston family as kind of a part of and parcel of their real estate empire. I think they gave the land, the Houston family gave the land for us. Like, well, this will make this part of Philadelphia more attractive. And just think about it, the fact that Philadelphia, which was the start of it, had 3 cricket clubs that all supported squash: Germantown, Marion, and Philadelphia. That's a lot of people with a lot of money. A whole new class of people were moving out here. And I like to think of Philadelphia as kind of like the Silicon Valley of the Victorian age. You had this Pennsylvania Railroad, all this manufacturing, a lot of people who were making their money, doing office work. Also, people who had made their money in investments. And I think it was also part, not just the suburban movement, but also a bit of this feeling of like, we have all these, people, men at the time, who are not out there doing physical labor. This is part of this sort of, I guess you can say it was part of this sort of Owen Wister movement of like trying to get out physical activity and taking out your nerves. You could either go out to Wyoming on the rescue and shoot game and ride horses, or you can go to your club in Germantown or Marion and take out your aggression, quote unquote, on the cricket field or on the squash courts. And I think you also had business was all conducted in town, very different from today. But if you worked as an office, you were downtown, so you're like, okay, I can go to my club on the weekends, but during the work day or just after the work day, I can go to my club in downtown Philadelphia. And I think, the Racket Club was fascinating, Jim, how squash really got its first sort of tenuous beginnings as we know it on the rickety rooftop court on top of the old Racket Club of Philadelphia building. Right. So I think that there was that. I think it was the development of a new class of people, a new type of real estate venture where more people had more money than ever before. At the same time, we cannot forget that this was an age of immense wealth disparities and civil unrest. A lot of parallels with today. I think that there was this tension, people wanting to move out to the suburbs, many ways to get away from unhealthy air and crime. And I think there was that tension there. So, but yeah, I think it was also a time when England was the leading nation in the world, and America was kind of rising very quickly behind it. And there was this feeling of like, among people like, bankers like JP Morgan, people like George Dunton Widener, another Titanic victim who basically bankrolled the construction of the Racket Club of Philadelphia, or the Worcester family that basically wrote a check for the Germantown Cricket Club, or the Houston family that wrote a check basically for Philly cricket. They're like, we need to connect our culture with England. Does that make sense, Jim?
Yeah, no, that's all correct. And I think when the Racket Club of Philadelphia, before it moved to its current building in 1907, it had this little fives court, it was called, up in the attic, and people fell in love with the game of squash, despite the fact that it was, this tiny little court and wasn't sort of being pushed by the club. It was the other sports that the club was trying to promote. There was something inherent in the game that people fell in love with. I think they did like the idea that it seemed like this was some old British game, and in the same way that cricket was so popular in North America in the 1890s, in part that Anglophilic kind of, if they're doing this in England, we should do it here. Squash was sort of considered an English game, and we can do that and be more British than the British. In fact, in 1907, when the Racket Club built their new clubhouse, there was this empty space, and the head professional at the club, who was from England, he said, "Oh, well, let's just use this space for that old great game of English doubles, squash doubles." And everybody's like, "Oh, okay, great." And of course, there was no version of squash doubles. He was creating it, but he knew that the way to persuade the members of the Racket Club to agree to build a court in this 25 by 45 foot space was to say, "Oh, well, let's play that British game." And so there was a real feeling of like, let's be like the Brits.
That's so cool. I love, one of my favorite sections of your book is actually the acknowledgement section of all the people that you've spoken. Hundreds and hundreds of institutions and the research. And I feel like I'm just imagining, but I would imagine most of this time we've talked about already has been more research, I would imagine. And then kind of moving into firsthand accounts and maybe secondhand accounts of, the 20s and 30s and 40s and so on.
Yeah.
What was that like? Talking to all these people all over the world, I'm sure a lot of interesting conversations. That any of it stand out?
Well, the reason I got into it was, I was writing about the game, and having grown up like you in the game with a father who was super active, and he'd grown up in the game. We're sort of nearing his 75th anniversary of him starting squash in an organized way, and so I always was interested in the history and who are these people, and that crazy story about somebody doing something and that match, what happened in there, and so right when I started writing about it, I immediately gravitated towards the history and towards tracking down people, and I was able to reach out to the guy at the time was the oldest living national champion, and went and spent a day with him at his house, and was like, I thought it was great, and like just had such an interesting time. And then I tracked down his younger brother, who was the second oldest living national champion, and that article came out in 1999 in Squash Magazine. And then that summer, I was like, I'm going to go to England and go to Harrow. And like, nobody had ever gone to Harrow to find out what exactly had happened. I'm the only one who's gone ever. And so there was something organic about me wanting to kind of put some flesh and facts around the bones that I'd grown up listening to these stories and hanging out in locker rooms and talking to people, in the gallery, in between matches, and just kind of feeling that there was a great untapped history in our game. And the game itself is fantastic, and I love playing, but it's also the people around the game and the characters that fall in love with it, that are obsessed with squash, and following it and being a part of that community. So I've always enjoyed being able to be a part of a community. And when the book came out in 2003, my editor's like, "Wow, great! You're working on another book," which I was. And he's like, "Well, I guess you'll just like leave the squash community behind." And I was like, "No, I don't think I'll ever be able to. Like, I think I'll still continue to not only be professionally involved with squash, which I have for the last 22 years since then, but also personally, like I still play tournaments, still love being a part of it, and that's because the community, the people in the squash world are so interesting and engaged in the game, but also engaged in the wider world, and so I haven't been able to extricate myself from that community.
Jim, I just have to say some of the surprises. I mean, first of all, I found like the character of Vic Niederhofer fascinating. Like these brilliant eccentrics.
Yeah.
I was also surprised, and he, came as an outsider, grew up as a Jewish kid in Brighton Beach, and
Yep.
And proved his worth at Harvard, and just was just dressed funny. It was kind of like they had these rituals, and just some creative people. I had no idea. Like Leonard Bernstein was a squash guy, the historian Gene Strauss, Frank Stella, the artist. I'm like, wow, all these creative people who are just get hooked. It's not just the people that grew up at the country clubs. It's like,
no, that's right. I think on the surface, squash has always appeared until recently, perhaps, as a sort of upper class white male game, but underneath, behind that veneer, that facade, there's an incredible diversity, in so many ways. And, a guy like Frank Stella he just died. And, we all have been thinking about him last year about, he's this curmudgeonly guy who got into squash. He went to Princeton, but didn't ever play there. But he got into squash because he hurt his back opening a garage door, and his doctor's like, "Well, you can't really play tennis anymore." So he's like, "All right, I'll try squash." So like a lot of people, he got into the game at middle age, not as a young kid like Dave and I, but he got into it as an adult, and he got obsessed with it and was trying to play every day and trying to improve. And he wasn't a good player. And the vast majority of people who love squash are not good players, right? I mean, if you look at it statistically, something like 60% of players are sort of what we used to call C players. And they are the ones that really support the game. They're the anchor of the game. And Frank was like that. And, he got into it and running tournaments and becoming a mentor to a lot of players from around the world who were moving to New York. Always promising John Nimick he'd deliver a trophy for the tournament champions, and year after year that wouldn't happen, and it finally happened just before he died. So Frank's a great example of somebody who just loved the game. I mean, Arlen Specter was the same exact thing. Turned 40, he's like, I got to get in shape, and he ended up playing squash basically every day, 350 days a year after year after year, and because he was a senator and traveling all around the country and all around the world, it was the main job of his chief of staff to arrange squash games in every city in the world. And he played in like over 100 countries, and he played every day. And it was I think for most people, squash is beautiful in that you go on the court and you get off the court after 45 minutes, an hour, and you can't remember what you were worrying about before you went on court. And other sports, they give you too much time, right? Tennis, like you got to go back and pick up the ball, and by then you're thinking about the that email you have to send. But in squash, you just you just go and you have no time to think, and that's what appealed to Frank and Arlen and basically everybody who plays the game is it your mind goes blank for all those off-court issues, and that's a real. I think it's always been something that has been a real attraction for people picking it up and falling in love with it. Is the way it sort of gives you a mental shower.
Just to play off of that, Jim, and to sort of connect back what I was talking about earlier about the development of, this sort of divide between town and country clubs, is that I think, say, compared to, say, cricket, which takes forever, and back then you'd had there's a wonderful photograph I've seen of Germantown cricket showing like crowds of people watching the game in like 1895. It's like,
Yep.
That sounds something like who would have the energy for that? Just like just hang out outside of the fence watching the game. But I think, as you mentioned in your book about like by the 1920s, the sort of Gilded Age leisure era is gone. More people, are just, unless you're very wealthy, you're working. You need time. You have a very compressed amount of time, like at lunch or whatnot, and for the better, family obligations have changed. So you're expected to be at home as a male at the time when it was an all male sport. So I think it fit in nicely where I can do my family obligations. Don't have to take a 2-hour lunch to do whatever. I can get my workout in, and then I get my work done, and then get on the train and go back to the suburbs to be home. So I think maybe that was part of its staying power. It's very economical in so many ways. Does that make sense, Jim?
No, it does. And, I love cricket and but the traditional version of cricket, it takes 5 days to figure out who's going to win. And golf, is obviously, we love golf as well, but it takes 4 or 5 hours to get through the 18 holes. And so I think it's always been wonderful that it's very engrossing, and it only can take you, a lot of the clubs, it's like 40 minutes and that's all your court time. And so the fact it's so quick, I think people has made it appealing. There's still a very high ceiling, and the game of pickleball is becoming super popular, and I'm seeing it here in England, and it's really kind of getting around the world. But there's a feeling among people who master the game of pickleball that it doesn't have as sort of a great depth on the ceiling. It's the challenge is sort of once you get pretty good at it, it's not as challenging. And people have always loved squash because it does have this great variety. There are different shots, and the tactics are interesting. So your mind really has to concentrate on what your opponent's doing. And unlike almost every other racket sport, you're sharing the same space with your opponent. And so that is very challenging, and also promotes there's sort of a core sportsmanship about squash that you have to have it, and you can get away with poor behavior, say in tennis, because your opponent is 40 feet away, and so I think a lot of people, it's appealing the cricket-like emphasis on sportsmanship, but in cricket it's sort of the culture of the game, where in squash it's like beyond the culture. It's like squash doesn't work if you have two people not giving space, and that's a real sort of core characteristic of the game.
I love this quote somewhere in the book. I forgot who said it. We said, like, the guy in the court can be your best friend, but as soon as you get on the court with him or her, they're the enemy. They're the enemy.
Yep.
I was reading. I would love to read a couple quick quotes, because it's the kind of thing that you and Steve, you can describe things that people like me can't. But it's just a beautiful way of describing the sport. I thought, squash. You might play chess. Squash is a cumulative game. You pile up tiny victories. You employ tactics. You hunt for psychological advantages. You retreat with the Sicilian defense. Whatever you do, an opponent answers back. You have to react to him. If squash is literature, it is poetry. Its lines are short but heavy with meaning. It condenses, concentrates, distills, and refines. It exposes your character like an X-ray exposes bones. It is madness in an unpadded cell. I read that and I thought, man, it's so good. It's just such a beautiful sport. And I think you're so right. It's like, in a funny way, the better you get, the more complicated the game becomes and the more variables there are. And because there's an opponent, there's always this reaction. You can see different strategies and tactics work for one player, but not for another. It's like the better you get, the more rewarding the game is.
Right.
And it's just such a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's why we're sort of seeing this huge renaissance, if I would describe it that way. Since, and I'm skipping forward a little bit, but I couldn't believe. I mean, I'd always heard about the transition of hardball to softball, and this is a little bit before my time, and I sort of watched over that. I couldn't believe how big of a decision that was in the United States.
Yeah. And
the complexities behind it, the voting of college squash. I heard, Bob Callahan being a part of that, former Princeton coach. And also just this dynamic of not wanting to, for lack of piss off the biggest supporters of squash who loved hardball in America, but moving to a softball game. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind. For me, it was a big learning to read about that, not being around at the time.
Yeah, no, I grew up playing hardball and played hardball in college. And 30 years ago, we did this transition to the international standard, which meant switching the ball, which was very easy. And the balls were, had evolved dozens of times. Both hardball and softball had, always had evolving. So it wasn't sort of, we stuck to one standard for centuries. And the courts were 2.5 feet different in width. And that just proved to be such a stumbling block. Now, we always say that the Brits got it wrong, that we standardized an 18.5 foot wide court, which was very close to the original Harrow courts. And they eventually, 25 years after we standardized, the Brits standardized a 21-foot court. And so they ignored us and they ignored the sort of origins of the game, and caused sort of a century of agony about two different court sizes. And so in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of North America began to switch over from our traditional hardball version, and people were traveling. There were famous junior trips to Australia. People started being exposed to softball, which they really hadn't been. The globalization of the game really only began in the 1970s, when that was the first time there was world championships. And when they're like, oh, we're going to have a world championship. Well, it's got to be in softball, because that's what basically everybody else plays outside of North America. And then, typical Canada decided to sort of transition earlier than we did. And so in the 1980s, you guys in Canada were basically playing both sports, and building softball courts, but still playing hardball. Where even into the first softball court was only built in the mid 1970s, and even 10 years later there was only a dozen courts in the state. So we had not really begun that transition until the late 1980s and early 1990s, when all of a sudden it just clicked over and we switched. Sort of almost overnight. There was a lot of agony about it, and 30 years later, everybody sort of forgets. But back at the time, there was a lot of angst, a lot of angry letters being written and phone calls, and people really upset about it. We had over 3,000 courts, hardball courts, and so it was a massive infrastructure that needed to change, and that was really hard for clubs and schools. Half the courts in the United States are at high schools and colleges, universities. And so that whole group had to switch over. And it cost hundreds of millions of dollars to do the transition. And, there was something lost for sure. Hardball singles was a fantastic game, and it has some attributes that softball just doesn't have. And some of that has been sublimated into squash doubles, proper squash doubles, hardball doubles. And so we still get to hit the double boast, and there's still something about serving. However, the advantages of everybody in the world playing one version of the game, obviously that's directly led to squash being a part of the Olympics in 2028. It's great that we're all sort of on one standard. But there is a feeling still that we lost something in that version of the game. But 30 years later, I think we've all sort of moved on.
Well, tremendously, right? To think that there were 3,000 hardball courts in the mid 1990s. Officially USSRA decides to move to softball, and in 30 years, I was just trying to put together some statistics. We think there are hundreds of high school programs. I think low hundreds of college squash programs. The women's softball players are some of the best in the world in America. We have the National Arlen Squash Center, dozens of squash and educational alliance programs serving communities all over the country. Like you said, there's the U.S. Olympics are being hosted, or the squash Olympics are being hosted in the United States, in Los Angeles. It's like this perfect. I thought it was this microcosm of America, because it wasn't like it was some government dictate to we're going to move over to. It was a group of people had this idea that we're going to move to the international standard, and man, we're going to do it right, and we're going to invest a lot of money and time and effort, and we're going to be the best. And the transition is unbelievable in such a short amount of time, and you've been right in the center of it.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard, and sometimes it would cost $1 million to renovate a squash court, one court. So the money was tremendous, and but what we've sort of seen is we had a great squash culture for literally 100 years in America. And we still have that culture. We still have the same people. We have the same clubs. But what has happened is at the same time, the game has expanded, and we've began focusing really intensely about access and having more people into the game. So the game has never been so vibrant in America as it is now. I mean, far and away, with more high schools, more colleges playing the game, with 25 urban squash programs, part of the Squash and Education Alliance, all these community centers like the Arlen Specter U.S. Squash Center that are not just accessible, but intentionally reaching out to communities to bring them in, to expose them to the game, and so the community has expanded so tremendously. One of the reasons why we switched from hardball to softball in the late 80s, early 90s was because of the Olympics, because squash got into the Commonwealth Games, squash got into the Pan American Games, and we became part of the USOPC. And so, everybody was like, well, we're starting to play softball because, the Pan American Games are going to be in softball. And so, ironically now, 30 years later, 35 years later, we're getting into the Olympic Games. And that, again, is a great catalyst. Now, squash courts are being built. There's over 1,000 courts have been built in China in the last 18 months. And so the Olympics are going to have a great impact globally. And they're having a nice impact in America in a lot of ways. But the great thing is that we are, the strongest we've ever been by every metric. And that bodes well for sort of the post-Olympic, after LA 28, what will happen to squash in America. There's a lot of, positivity around that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any predictions? What do you think? Do you think we're going to have a world championship team come out of here, wearing a world championship, maybe, an Olympic medals in the future?
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if we did not have an Olympic medal. If we didn't have somebody up on the podium 3 years from now. Um, I think, 30, 40 years ago, everybody thought Pakistan was just this invincible squash nation. And they had, only among the men, but with the men, they had so many great players and, all the champions. And now, 40 years later, it's Egypt, and Egypt is even stronger. And of course, it's with men and women, and they are very dominant, but nothing lasts forever. And so, yes, I do hope that, I think the women are, much closer to winning a world team title. They lost in the finals last month, so they're close. And the men are a little bit further behind, but there's a lot of great young players out there who are coming on. I think you look at what's happening in Canada. Canada is not as vibrant probably as the U.S. is at the moment. I always used to say that Toronto was the best squash city in the world in terms of people playing in singles and doubles leagues. The world's biggest doubles league, bar none, and so much going on squash wise. And it was one of the few cities where you could say, "Oh yeah, I play squash," and like everybody knew what that was.
Yeah.
And so, I think some of the other countries like Canada are struggling a little bit more with the sort of where things are after the pandemic. And I think the Olympics are obviously a great boost to help catalyze some more development.
Just as an add-on to the growth of the sport, I think, COVID has brought out this huge desire in people to be social. I mean, what could be the least COVID-friendly sport than being with another person in an enclosed room?
Yeah.
But I've just noticed this is that I think there's just in this reaction after 2 years of a lot of people just being in isolation of just like, I want to get off the Peloton. I want to get off working out in a room by myself. I want to be with someone. I want to, get to know new people. And I think that's why there's a lot of people who are starting off who are now like addicted because I think there was that sense, especially people with families, of isolation. Now they're like, this is great. I have a community. And I think one thing I'd like to, talk to you about more, Jim, is like more about your own writing career. In addition to your wonderful book on squash, you have a really successful writing career and other books. Can you talk more about how you transitioned from squash into being a full-time writer? And your wonderful quote on poetry summed it up. But could you talk more about the link of how the game of squash informs your creative process? I mean, you've written about apartheid in South Africa. You've written about exploitation in the 18th century. Like, talk a bit more about your writing work in general.
Well, I was teaching at a high school and decided I really wanted to be a writer, and that was sort of where my core passion was. And so I started freelancing and writing, and that was 32 years ago. So I've sort of been a freelance writer ever since. And one of the things I've loved about being a writer, a journalist, historian, is not having just one topic. Both my wife and I almost went and got PhDs in history, and we both backed out of it before we met each other because we decided I didn't want to be an absolute expert about just one tiny slice of the world. But I like dabbling in a bunch of fields and learning about human nature and storytelling that isn't sort of defined by one topic. And my first book took 17 years to write. It was my senior thesis at college, and a year after I finished it, I got a book contract to have it come out, but it took another 16 years before it did come out. And that was the one about South Africa. I got to live in South Africa for 3 years after college and worked on that project. And I played in a squash league in Cape Town, and it was a really special time. And then I've always stumbled into other topics. My book about John Ledyard, the 18th century explorer, you'd probably like it, Stephen, because it's he was on Captain Cook's third voyage, and that was those 3 voyages were sort of the going to the space shuttle or going to Mars version in the 18th century. So he lived an extraordinary life, and I loved. I spent 5 years working on that project. The squash book started and completed in only 3 or 4 years, so that was pretty fast for me. But I've just loved being able to bounce around and writing magazine articles and book reviewing and sort of being involved in the community, the literary community, as it were, but not being narrowly defined. I think that's been something I've loved.
Well, and now we're getting a re-release in September. Is that right?
Yeah. So for years, I've been hoping to have a paperback version of the book come out, and Scribner's going to be publishing that a paperback version. Now, there turns out there's a couple errors and typos in the book. I know. I'm glad you're sitting down because it's a bit shocking. So I've been making some corrections and editing as we went along. It turns out things I wrote 25 years ago, I probably didn't, sometimes write it beautifully. So I'm editing some things and writing a long afterword talking about what's happened in squash in America in the last 25 years. And it turns out a lot has happened since I put the manuscript to bed in 2001, 2002. So it's forced me to sort of look back on the last couple decades and the just incredible changes. And when you live through it, you sometimes don't sit back and look at it and say, wow, like this is a big change. So we that's going to come out and be a huge bestseller, I think. My other book about squash, which is a biography of the Trinity squash coach, we have sold the movie rights to 3 different groups of people, and the group that has it right now is promising that they're going to start filming later this year to make a movie. I think the biggest problem is who's playing me. And George Clooney and Brad Pitt are really fighting over getting the role. So figuring that out, and So the book lives on. It was great fun to write, and it's continued to be sort of a part of my life. And I have my original copy with me, and I open it up almost every day to find something for somebody. So,
and just as to add on, I mean, and congratulations on the movie and the Trinity coach. But I love also how you write about some of these college coaches who were such characters in their own right. I mean, I look at a guy like Harry Cowles and like how he had this like amazing career, and then he kind of flared out in his 40s. It's just amazing. But you see these, it's just amazing what life throws at people, how they reach such heights, and then things don't work out. I mean, some of the portrayals were very moving, actually, how these guys would come into these universities and it often would not have the best raw material. It's amazing how disorganized a lot of the playing was, and they molded them into, this often motley group of players into a force. I think your portrayal of that was just wonderful. Could you speak a bit more about who are a couple of your favorite coaches?
Well, I think you're hitting on something. These are 18 to 22-year-olds, and the mentoring that happens among these young people by these coaches. So many people experience this, and Bob Callahan was one of the great guys in the game, an incredible mentor for Dave and for thousands of other people at Princeton, um, and through the century, college squash is just over 100 years old in America. So many women and men have had those experiences of really bonding with their squash coach. Some of it is if you go to a school that's far away from other schools, you're in the van a lot, and you're just like hours. And I luckily was in the van before the invention of smartphones and AirPods and things. So we all had to talk to each other. And just today I talked to a former teammate of mine. Those bonds are lifelong bonds of connection, because you're spending hours in the dark, in the cold, driving along. So we've had a century of that, with these coaches are incredible mentors, not just about the game and tactics and how your backhand is terrible, but and trying to fix it, but also as human beings, about getting these kids to grow up, to be mature, and to go out into the world and do great things and be a good citizen. And a lot of them, like Harry Cowles or Bob, died too young, and there are a lot of people who are still thinking about them, and there's hundreds and hundreds of kids every year who graduate from a college program, and they're all going out into the world, having that bonding moment, not only with their teammates, but with their coaches.
Yeah, it's so special. I mean, I I was lucky enough to play for Bob and have 4 years with that team, and it's just this is the kind of memories that you never forget, and he put such an emphasis on sportsmanship and the way you play and shaking hands and those little things that matter. They matter, and they go beyond squash. They go beyond sport, right? And it is such a special world to live in, I think. And like you said, you able to live in. I didn't realize you had to live in playing Cape Town, London now, all across the United States. You have this amazing community, and like really, it's almost like having family all over the world. Like the way you get treated, it's really special.
Yeah. I just played a couple weeks ago in London with a guy. I walk out in the court, and he's like, "This is the 14th day in a row I've played squash," and he's 60 years old. I'm like, "Oh my God, like I haven't played in 6 months. Like, don't hurt me." But there is a great community. Some of us have started playing more doubles than singles, and some people are playing more paddle, or padel as it's called in the States, and but the community has not changed. It's still vibrant, and it's people. Those friendships that you develop. Whether you're playing with an 80-year-old or somebody who's younger, from a different background or the exact same background, the commonality of spending time on this court, on this tiny little court, bashing a ball around, that creates sort of connections that are very hard to break.
I just like to add on, I'm 45, but I've been playing regularly. A gentleman who is about 80, and he asked me if we wanted to play regularly every Tuesday. And very, kind, distinguished gentleman. He's been a governor at Germantown for several years. And I was just amazed, inspired at this guy, how he was 80 odd years old and was still able to hit the ball just the right place, would drive me insane. But I was inspired at how, this guy keeps at it, because that's what keeps him going. He owed his dedication to racket sports, to tennis and squash, to helping him survive a major health scare. But then I was reading your book, and I saw the name Steve Ferran come up, the famous coach at the Harvard Club. And he also owned a famous store in New York, the Go-To Squash store. He was an Irish immigrant. And so I texted Dick Ferran. I'm like, is this any connection to you? What 2-word response? My grandfather. I'm like, oh, that explains a lot. And I was like, what an honor. He never said anything about it. I just was inspired by how, as someone who had been playing racket sports for a very long time, was still good at it and knew how to hit the ball precisely. Yeah. And I think that that's one thing that sort of seeing people of all ages, especially older people playing, are like, okay, if I'm 45, I'm a father of 2, and I want to get over the hump, I look at these people and I'm like, gotta keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah. And, well, I mean, both Dave and I, our fathers still play, and I've gotten on the doubles court with Dave's father, and my dad's 84 and still plays a couple days a week, and he's still good. But it's we say that it's a lifetime game, and you're playing to fit for life, and it is true, and so many people. I just got an email today from a friend of mine. He said, "Oh, I've just had my shoulder redone, and I'm getting back out there." People are trying their best, with all the injuries that everybody faces to continue playing and being a part of it. And so that's a real special part of the game. Is still small enough that we know a lot of the people, know a lot of the coaches, know a lot of the tournaments, and you're still able to access the game in a way it's just harder in tennis or squash, where there's just so many people. It's really hard to know as many people probably as intimately as you can in this sort of niche sport of squash.
Well, Jim and Dave, I deeply appreciate your time on this interview, and any closing final thoughts. I'm a historian who, I feel like kind of like a Frank Stella sort of character who is, who loves the game, but is not particularly, great at it, but just loves it. But it's an honor to talk to you two about this, and any closing thoughts about what the game means for you, for both of you.
I guess I'll let you know the last words. For me, it's just a connection to all my friends and all my family. And now later in my life, it's an excuse to see my dad, 3 or 4 times a year, and see my sister and see my mom, and see Jim's dad. And you go to these tournaments, it's just a really special community. And it's always had such a deep personal connection. And I just feel really grateful that, I can understand its context in history, and it goes back, I just wanted to say one thing, Jim, this is the kind of book that can only be written at a certain time by a certain type of person. To be able to talk to all these people, get those firsthand accounts and bring those stories to life. I just want to say thank you. It's for a game that just means the world to me, to be able to kind of go back in time. It's just really special. So thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. It's been fun to talk about. I never get bored of talking about squash and the people, the quirky characters. When you said about Frank, so Frank, people would always approach him and say, "Hey, you're this famous artist. What's the intersection? Tell me about the intersection of squash and art." And so I just so he had this great quote that from the mid '80s when he was getting into the game and promoting squash tournaments. He said, "I can forget about painting. It's a white blank wall and a ball. You don't know where you are. It's like a snowstorm." He said, "I'm not tempted to paint squash scenes. All squash has tempted me to do is to break my racket."
That's great.
It is a frustrating game. You always want to be better, and the best players in the world will say they come off the court as frustrated as a D player, always wanting to improve and to get perfect length. Yeah, no, it's been great to talk about it, and we'll get on court soon with both you guys, I hope.
That's great.
Thank you so much. Well, David Letourneau and James Zug, thank you so much for your time on the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. It's an honor to have both of you. And, keep up the fine writing, Jim. And Dave, keep up the fine squash playing and fathering. This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.